Hey traders, it's John Fortune here of this week's weekly Forex forecast for the 5th of October to the 9th of October 2020. As always, we're going to start off by looking at the US dollar index and crude oil before running through a number of markets, looking at the key levels of support and resistance in the process. And we're also going to be highlighting some of the targets that we're going to be looking for in this coming week and also for future weeks. So I hope you're having a nice weekend. Let's jump over to the charts and see where the money is this week. As always, we're going to start off by looking at the US dollar index. Now, something to note before we look at the dollar index is that we are 1 month out as of today from the US election. This is the next big trading event on the 3rd of November. And between now and then, I would not be surprised to see a bit of a risk-off mentality coming into the markets as uncertainty and volatility picks up, leading into the election and possibly a couple of weeks after the election. And what this is going to do is it's going to likely see some profit taking coming in from all of those buyers from the March lows in the stock market. Anybody who bought the dip likely to start booking some profits coming into the election. And over the next 4 weeks, I wouldn't be surprised to see a bit of a risk-off mentality, which is going to apply upward pressure to the dollar, upward pressure to the yen, and downward pressure on the other currencies. So just a thought going into the next 4 weeks in terms of the fundamental side of this. On a technical basis, which is what we look at here every single week in the videos, we were expecting a correction back down to the 93.03. We did get this correction, but we failed to really rally. There was a bit of a low volatility week in the dollar and the dollar pairs last week. We had this correction and the market pretty much went nowhere. So very simply put, going into this week, this is now setting up to be a great place to start to look for a breakout to the upside in the dollar index. If we can start to break, and preferably if we can come and break above the 9400 here, this is going to present a great opportunity to start to look for further advances to the upside in the dollar index. First of all, up to the highs, and then we'll be looking up towards the next key of resistance to the upside at 95.72. We're not trading the dollar index, we're just using the dollar index as a guide. And so we do go into next week with a bullish bias on the dollar. That means we'll be primarily looking for dollar bullish setups in the dollar pairs going into next week. So the next market we're going to look at is crude oil. Last week we started the week up in this area and we were looking for short positions down towards the 34.35. We did have a nice break and a pullback and we had a really nice sell-off down towards this level. This was actually a good market last week. We haven't come all the way down to the target yet, so very simply put, for anybody who was not involved in this from last week, any correction this week back towards the 40.20 area, we don't have to come back and retest it, just a correction in this direction is going to be viewed as another great opportunity next week to start to look for bearish setups. And we're going to be looking at initiating shorts down towards the next key of support to the downside and the target set at the 34.35. So the next market we're going to look at is euro dollar. Now last week we started the week down in this area and we highlighted the fact we want to see a pullback towards the 1.18210. We do have a nice pullback in this market now. So very simply put, going into this week, we're going to be looking at initiating shorts. Any breakout to the downside, we haven't quite broken down yet. I'd like to see this come down to the 1.1680 for this to really break down. But any break to the downside here is going to simply be viewed as a great opportunity next week to start to look for bearish positions. And we're going to be looking at initiating shorts down towards the next key of support to the downside and the target set at the 1.1454. So the next market we're going to look at is pound dollar. Now last week we started the week right here and we were looking for a pullback towards the 1.29260 highlighted in last week's video, and we did have a nice pullback into this key area of resistance highlighted last week. So very simply put, going into this week, this is now a great place to start to look for bearish setups in this market. And if we start to break to the downside, we're going to be looking at initiating shorts down towards the next key area of support to the downside and the target set at the 1.2667. So the next market we're going to look at is US dollar Japanese yen. Now last week we highlighted the fact we'd been looking for a pullback towards the 106.040 and we did pull back towards this area and we started to sell off last week. The US dollar is currently strong and any positions in this market as it's currently structured to the downside would preferably be short positions, and what this means is shorting a strong dollar. So if you really want, you could leave this out for next week. Personally, I actually would prefer to look for short positions in this market despite the fact we have a strong dollar. Why? Because of what I said at the beginning of the video, it looks like we're starting to get a strong dollar because of a risk-off mindset coming into the stock market. And when money comes out of stocks and it goes back into currencies, what you tend to see is the US dollar will not appreciate as much as the yen does in a risk-off scenario. Therefore, you can have the dollar appreciating against all other currencies, whilst at the same time it declines against the yen. So for that reason, I personally would prefer to look at this next week. I wouldn't have any problem shorting this. What we would like to see is we've actually already started to break to the downside. So very simply put, going into next week, this is going to be a great place to look for short positions, as we already are. Any continued pullback in this area is going to be viewed as a great opportunity next week to start to look for short positions, as I said. And we're going to be looking at initiating shorts down towards the next key of support to the downside and the target set at the 103.56. The other takeaway from this as well is that the yen is actually quite strong, and this also gives you an indication with some of the other pairs you may be looking at next week. You may want to look towards long yen positions, so euro yen to the downside, CAD yen to the downside, etc. Those type of setups would make sense going into next week. So next market we're going to look at is Aussie dollar. Now last week we started the week down in this area and we're looking for a pullback towards the 0.72810, and we have had a nice pullback towards this level. Going into this week, therefore, we're looking for short positions in this market as the preferred play. Any break to the downside in this market is going to provide an opportunity to start to look for those bearish setups. And we're going to be looking at initiating shorts. First of all, down to the previous lows. So if you want a conservative target here for next week, as it may take 2 weeks to come down to the 0.6809, may take a couple of weeks because this is quite a way below where we're sitting currently in terms of price. So for a more conservative target for next week, if you want to book some profits for next week, if you're looking for a target, the 0.70000 would be a good conservative target, or the previous low down here. But overall, we are looking for this to come down to the next key of support to the downside and the target set at the 0.6809. So just to confirm, this is our major target to the downside, but it may take a couple of weeks to get there. If you want a conservative target on the short side going into next week, it would be the previous low down here, or the 0.70000 psychological number in this area. So next market we're going to look at is New Zealand dollar. Now last week we were looking for a correction towards the 0.67420, and we have now had this correction. This sets up a nice opportunity to the downside. We have some space down towards our target here of the 0.6489. So very simply put, any further correction in this market is simply going to be treated as an opportunity to short this at a better price. We're going to be looking next week for bearish breakouts to the downside, and any bearish breakout to the downside is going to be viewed as an opportunity to short this market. And we're going to be looking at initiating shorts down towards the next key of support to the downside and the target set, the 0.6489. The next market we're going to look at is US dollar Swiss franc. Now we started last week right here, and we highlighted in last week's video that we're looking for a pullback towards the 0.91140. We have had a nice pullback now towards this area. So very simply put, going into this week, any further correction is simply going to be viewed as an opportunity to look for bullish setups. And if we start to break to the upside in this market, we're going to be looking at initiating longs up towards the next key of resistance to the upside of the target set at the 0.9367. Now again, with this market, it may take a couple of weeks to get to this resistance area. If you want to take a conservative target for next week, then you would be looking towards the 0.9300 or this previous high up in this area. But overall, we are looking for this market to come up to the 0.9367. It just may take longer than a week to get there. So the next market we're going to look at is US dollar CAD. Now last week we started the week in this area and we're looking for a correction back down towards the 1.32070. We did correct down towards this area. We haven't come down and tagged it yet, but we have started to correct towards this area. So very simply put, going into this week, we are looking for further advances to the upside. Any further correction in this market is simply going to be viewed as an opportunity to look for bullish breakouts to the upside. And we also saw oil selling off last week, and the US dollar sold off against the Canadian dollar. So the US dollar CAD is inversely correlated to crude oil. So I would not be surprised to see this fall back in line with the correlation next week and start to break to the upside. So US dollar CAD to the upside is definitely something we'll be focusing on next week. What we need to see though is we do need to see some bullish reversals in this area. So if we start to break to the upside, this is going to be a great opportunity to look for long positions. And we're going to be looking at initiating longs up towards the next key of resistance, the upside, the target set, the 1.3499. And last but not least, we have gold. Now last week we started the week right down here and we were looking for a correction towards the 1948.95. We have had a nice pullback in gold. So very simply put, going into this week, we are looking for bearish setups in this market. Any break to the downside, if we could come down and break the 1890, this would be a great opportunity to start to look for short positions in this market. And we're going to be looking at initiating shorts down towards the next key of support to the downside and the target set at the 1815.28.